I never thought I'd be sharing this story. For months I've debated whether to upload these tapes, whether anyone would even believe what I found. But after what happened last week, I can't keep this to myself anymore. The world needs to know the truth about Paul Bunyan, about what's really out there in our forests, about what happened to my grandfather, and why certain parts of our national parks are still mysteriously closed off to this day. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I do. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting here, hands shaking as I digitized these VHS tapes, I would have laughed. Paul Bunyan was just a silly tourist attraction, right? Those giant statues dotting the northern states, those kitschy gift shops and pancake houses, they were just another piece of Americana, another way to draw families off the highway. That's what I thought too. That's what we were all supposed to think. But then I found the box, hidden in my grandfather's cabin, tucked away behind a false wall in his basement. 37 unmarked VHS tapes, each labeled only with coordinates and dates. A journal filled with his frantic handwriting. Forest Service documents that were never meant to see the light of day. And something else. Something that made my blood run cold when I first played it. You see, my grandfather wasn't just some retired Forest Service ranger with a hobby for recording things. He was part of something bigger, something that started in 1976 when he was assigned to investigate a series of unexplained incidents in the Chippewa National Forest. What he discovered out there, what he captured on these tapes, it changes everything we thought we knew about American folklore, about why certain stories get passed down, about why some legends are deliberately kept alive. I'm sharing this now because I have to. Because last week, while investigating the coordinates from his final tape, I heard it too. That impossible sound that he described in his last journal entry. That low, rhythmic whistling that seems to come from somewhere far above the tree line. And I saw. But no, we need to start at the beginning. You need to understand how deep this goes, how many people have worked to keep this hidden, and why those Paul Bunyan statues are still standing, still watching, still serving their true purpose after all these years. This isn't just another creepy story on the internet. Every location I'm about to mention is real. Every document can be verified. Every missing persons case actually happened. I've spent months fact-checking, cross-referencing, trying to prove myself wrong. But I can't ignore the evidence anymore. And after you see what I found, you won't be able to either. Just remember something as you watch this. If you ever find yourself in the northern forests and you hear whistling from above the trees, don't look up. Whatever you do, don't look up. My grandfather learned that lesson too late. I almost did too. This is the story of the Paul Bunyan tapes. And I swear to you, every word of it is true. I found the tapes 3 months after my grandfather's funeral. I was clearing out his cabin near the Chippewa National Forest. You know the type. One of those old ranger outposts that got converted into private property in the 90s. The kind of place where the shadows from the pine trees make everything feel a little darker than it should be, even at noon. The box wasn't meant to be found. I only discovered it because I was replacing some rotted floorboards in the basement. My crowbar hit something hollow behind the wall, and there it was, a metal ammunition box, the kind the Forest Service used to store emergency supplies. Inside were these VHS tapes, perfectly preserved, each one wrapped carefully in cloth. At first I didn't think much of it. Grandpa was always recording things, wildlife patterns, tourist activities, forest growth studies, standard ranger stuff. The first tape I pulled out was labelled simply Bemidji, 6/17/1976. I figured they were recordings of his work around the Paul Bunyan attractions. You know the ones, that famous 18-foot statue of Paul and Babe the Blue Ox that's been there since the 1930s. Every kid in Minnesota's gotten their picture taken there at least once. When I played that first tape, it started exactly how I expected. Tourist families milling around the statue on a sunny summer day, the kind of footage you'd see in any visitor center documentary. But then something happened at the 12-minute mark. The camera pans up to Paul's face, and I still can't explain what I saw. The statue's head was turned, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, but I know these landmarks. That statue's head has never moved. It can't move. That's when I really started looking at the labels. 37 tapes, spanning from 1976 to 1983. Each one marked with exact coordinates, dates, and these strange symbols I didn't recognize at first. Some deep in the Chippewa forest, others near other Paul Bunyan attractions across Minnesota, Wisconsin, even up into Michigan. Places where tourists never go, where the trees grow too close together, where the forest floor never sees sunlight. The thing that really got me, though, these weren't tourist videos at all. The dates, they lined up perfectly with a series of incidents my grandfather investigated during his time as a ranger. Incidents that were officially explained as bear attacks, as windstorm damage, as ecological anomalies. But the tapes tell a different story. There's one tape from October 1977, filmed near the old logging camp at Brainerd. In the background, behind the trees, there's something moving, something tall. The camera quality isn't great. It was the 70s after all, but you can see the trees bending around it. Not breaking, not snapping, but bending, like they were making way for something. Something that, according to the official Forest Service reports I later found, couldn't possibly exist. I've spent weeks analysing these tapes, cross-referencing the locations with old newspapers, with missing persons reports, with geological surveys. Everything connects, but nothing makes sense. Why did my grandfather hide these tapes so carefully? Why did he label some with red markers and others with blue? And why, in his final report before retiring in 1983, did he specifically request that all Paul Bunyan statues in the region remain under 24-hour video surveillance? The more I watched, the more I realized these tapes weren't just recordings. They were evidence. Evidence of something my grandfather spent years tracking, something he never told anyone about. Not even my father. Something that might explain why, even today, certain areas of our national forests remain mysteriously closed to the public, marked with those same strange symbols I found on the tapes. But it's what I found at the bottom of the box that really changed everything. A journal, written in my grandfather's handwriting, but different from his usual neat penmanship. The first entry is dated June 17, 1976, the same day as that first tape. It begins with 5 words that still haunt me. It's not a statue anymore. After finding that first journal entry, I knew I had to watch the tapes in order. My grandfather was methodical. He wouldn't have numbered them without reason. What I saw over the next few weeks changed everything I thought I knew about the forests I grew up in. The second tape, dated July 1976, shows the aftermath of what was officially reported as a localized windstorm near the Schoolcraft State Forest. But there's no wind in the footage. Just acres of trees, all bent in impossible angles, all pointing away from a central path. A path exactly 16 feet wide. The official report mentions wind speeds of 90 miles per hour, but if you look closely at the branches, they're not broken. They're curved, like something massive simply pushed through them. Then there's my grandfather's journal. His handwriting gets progressively more erratic as the entries continue. August 12, 1976. Third set of tracks found near Itasca, too large for any known species. The spacing suggests bipedal movement. Conservation team wants to attribute it to bear activity. They know better. September 23rd. It's following the old logging routes. Not random. These are paths. It's using paths. I started mapping the tape locations against newspaper archives from the period. What I found, it can't be coincidence. Between 1976 and 1983, 27 people went missing in Minnesota's northern forests. Each disappearance occurred within 2 weeks of my grandfather filming in the area. The official reports cite everything from hiking accidents to animal attacks, but my grandfather's journal tells a different story. October 15th, 1977, found another print today. 36 inches heel to toe, perfect human anatomical structure, just wrong scale. The indigenous rangers won't go near the site. They say their ancestors knew about this, said there's a reason they built the statues, not to honor it, to track it. The newspaper clippings he saved paint a pattern nobody seemed to notice. Or maybe they didn't want to notice. The Bemidji Pioneer 1978, unprecedented timber destruction puzzles forestry experts. The Brainerd Dispatch 1979, local logging operation halted after discovery of unexplained forest damage. The International Falls Journal, 1980. Scientists baffled by systematic tree destruction in remote areas. But it's tape number 17 that really shows the scale of what we're dealing with. December 1978, deep in the Superior National Forest. My grandfather was investigating reports of unusual seismic activity. The footage shows him measuring what looks like a footprint in the snow. The scale marker next to it reads 42 inches. But it's what happens at the 7-minute mark that makes my hands shake every time I watch it. The camera suddenly jerks upward, and for just a second, just one frame, you can see something moving between the trees. Something that makes those 18-foot Paul Bunyan statues look small. There's a notepaper clip to this tape's case. It's a formal request from my grandfather to his superiors asking for all Paul Bunyan attractions in the region to be equipped with surveillance equipment. At the bottom, in red ink, request approved. Implement Project Timberwatch immediately. Classification level 4. The last entry from 1978 just reads, "The statues were never monuments, they're measuring devices, and the measurements keep changing. It's getting bigger." I've tried contacting other former Forest Service rangers from that period. Most won't talk to me. The few who did all said the same thing. They were under strict orders never to discuss anything related to Project Timberwatch. One of them, after a few drinks, told me something that keeps me up at night. He said the Paul Bunyan statues aren't just measuring devices. They're markers, warning signs, and they're still being monitored today. But none of that prepared me for what I found in my grandfather's later tapes, or for what those coordinates in his final entry would lead me to discover. Some things, once you see them, you can't unsee, and some patterns, once you notice them, start showing up everywhere, even now, especially now. The more I dug into my grandfather's records, the more I realized he wasn't just documenting these incidents, he was actively involved in hiding them. There's a letter dated March 1979, stamped Classified Level 4, outlining protocols for explaining away large-scale forest damage. They had pre-written press releases for everything: windstorm damage, bear attacks, illegal logging operations. But it's what's between the lines that tells the real story. In one of the folders, I found a document that changed everything. It was labeled Entity PB1, Containment Protocols. The document itself was heavily redacted, but one paragraph remained clear. Subject demonstrates continued growth patterns consistent with historical records. Original 1937 measurements indicated approximate height of 20 feet. Current estimates suggest minimum height of 65 feet. Growth rate appears to correlate with deforestation activities in monitored zones. That's when I started looking deeper into the Paul Bunyan mythology itself. Everyone knows the story, right? The giant lumberjack and his blue ox, created by logging companies to boost morale in their camps. At least, that's what we're supposed to believe. But I found something interesting in the University of Minnesota's archives. The first written mentions of Paul Bunyan don't appear until after a series of unexplained incidents in Maine's logging camps in the late 1800s. The trail led me to an elderly Ojibwe historian in northern Minnesota. What she told me, it made too much sense. Her people had stories about something in the forests, something that had been there long before the logging camps. They called it the one who shapes trees. According to their legends, it wasn't a friendly giant helping loggers. It was a warning about taking too much from the forest. She showed me cave paintings dating back hundreds of years. They depicted a figure, impossibly tall, moving through the trees. The same figure appeared in petroglyphs across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, always near old-growth forests, always with the same symbol nearby, a symbol I recognized from my grandfather's tapes. The same symbol that's subtly incorporated into every Paul Bunyan statue's base. That's when it hit me. The tourist attractions. They were never meant to celebrate folklore. They're monitoring stations, carefully positioned based on historical sighting patterns. Each statue's base contains old military seismographic equipment, disguised as part of the foundation. The Paul Bunyan story wasn't created to spread tall tales. It was created to hide something much bigger. In my grandfather's later journals, he becomes obsessed with the growth patterns. December 1981, Entity shows direct correlation with forest destruction. As we cut down more trees, it gets bigger. It's not just following the logging operations anymore, it's responding to them. February 1982. Found records from the 1800s. Same pattern. The more they logged, the bigger it got. The story of Babe the Blue Ox, it wasn't about a companion. It was trying to describe something else they saw with it. The classified documents get more desperate in the later years. There are reports of the monitoring stations detecting movement patterns that shouldn't be possible. Emergency protocols for evacuating entire state parks without causing panic. Contingency plans for explaining away large-scale ecological events. But it's the last unredacted page that keeps me up at night. It's a memo from 1983, the year my grandfather retired. All Paul Bunyan installations to maintain 24-hour monitoring. Seismic activity suggests subject is no longer following historical migration patterns. Growth rate has exceeded all previous projections. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol Black Forest. The final entry in my grandfather's journal, written in shaking handwriting. They're not monitoring it anymore. They're trying to contain it. But you can't contain something that's still growing. The stories were supposed to make people stay away from the deep forests. Now they're attracting them. And it's watching. It's always been watching. I wish I could say this was all ancient history, but last month, 3 hikers went missing in the Chippewa National Forest. The official report blamed it on bears. But I've seen the satellite photos. The trees are bent again, just like in my grandfather's footage. Only this time the path is wider, much wider. What I'm about to share comes from the final set of tapes, the ones my grandfather marked with red labels and multiple warning symbols. I've spent weeks analyzing this footage frame by frame, and I still can't fully process what I'm seeing. But you need to understand. You need to know what's really out there. The first thing I noticed was the shadows. In footage from September 1982, shot near the Boundary Waters, you can see them crossing between the trees, not moving with the sun, moving against it. The largest one spans 3 separate clearings. I measured it against known landmarks in the frame. The calculations suggest a height of over 100 feet. That's not the scary part. The scary part is when you compare it to the shadows in earlier tapes. It's growing. It's still growing. Then there's the audio. I almost missed it at first, this low, constant frequency running through multiple tapes. When I isolated it and analyzed the sound waves, I found something impossible. It's a continuous tone at 7 Hz, a frequency that matches the resonant frequency of human eyeballs. Something was deliberately generating this sound. Something wanted to affect how people saw it. But it's my grandfather's final tape that reveals the full truth. October 15th, 1983. The footage starts normally. He's investigating reports of massive forest damage near the old Duluth logging routes. Then at 18 minutes in, the camera starts shaking. Not from movement, from impact tremors, regular, rhythmic, getting closer. What happens next? I've watched it hundreds of times, trying to convince myself it's a trick of light, a camera malfunction, anything but what it appears to be. The tree line splits, not from wind, not from machinery. Something pushes through them, something so tall the camera can't capture all of it in frame. My grandfather swings the camera upward, and for just 3 frames I've analyzed until my eyes blur, you see it. The government didn't create the Paul Bunyan story to celebrate logging heritage. They created it because they needed a way to explain what people were seeing in the forests. They needed everyone to think it was just stories, just statues, just tourist attractions. Because the truth is so much worse. Those classified documents I found, they explain everything. The original Paul Bunyan statues weren't monuments. They were measuring devices, calibrated to track something's growth. Every gift shop, every tourist center, they're monitoring stations. The surveillance cameras aren't for security. They're for tracking movement patterns. They hide the equipment in plain sight, because that's the last place anyone would think to look. And Babe the Blue Ox? That's the detail that haunts me most. In my grandfather's final journal entry, he wrote about what the loggers in the 1800s were really seeing. They weren't imagining a companion for their friendly giant. They were trying to describe something else that moved through the forests with it. Something that left tracks filled with bioluminescent fungi. Something that made the ground glow blue in its wake. The last page of the government file contains a single line that changes the context of every Paul Bunyan story ever told. Subject: demonstrates exponential growth corresponding directly to deforestation rates. Current forest loss suggests containment failure by 2025. That report was written in 1983, the same year my grandfather filmed his last tape. The same year he disappeared for 3 days and came back. Different. He never talked about what happened during those days. But in his journal, I found a hand-drawn map with a series of coordinates and one sentence: "It's not hungry for trees anymore." The final moments of his last tape show him running, the cameras pointing behind him as he flees through the forest. You can hear him breathing, hear the impact tremors getting closer. Then the camera looks up one last time, and the footage cuts to static. But in the last frame, stabilized and enhanced, you can see something that proves every word I'm telling you is true. Something that's still out there, still growing, still following the logging operations across our forests. Because here's the thing about those Paul Bunyan statues: they're still being maintained, still being monitored. And every year, they build them just a little bit taller. I wish I could tell you this was all ancient history, that whatever my grandfather documented ended with his final tape, but the numbers don't lie. In the past year alone, 17 people have gone missing in Minnesota's national forests. The official reports cite animal attacks, exposure, hiking accidents, but I've mapped every disappearance. They form a pattern, a path. The same path my grandfather documented 40 years ago, just wider. Last month, I did something I promised myself I'd never do. I followed my grandfather's coordinates to his last filming location. The spot itself is technically inside Chippewa National Forest, but it's in a section that's been mysteriously closed for environmental studies since 1983. The closure signs are new, but they bear that same symbol I found on my grandfather's tapes. I had to wait 3 days for the Forest Service patrols to change shifts. They maintain these closed areas more actively than any other part of the forest. If you watch long enough, you'll notice they're not monitoring for trespassers. They're always looking up. What I found there, I didn't bring a camera. After what happened to my grandfather, I knew better. But I took measurements. The footprint was there, exactly where he described it in his final entry, except it's not 42 inches anymore. It's 76. I used my entire backpack to measure it, and it still wasn't long enough to span the heel. But it's what I heard that night that finally made everything click. I was trying to take soil samples. The ground around these prints has unusual properties that government geologists have been quietly studying for decades. That's when the whistling started. Not from the ground, not from the trees, from above them, way above them. You know those Save the Forest campaigns that started popping up in the 90s. Look closely at who's funding them. Every major logging company in the northern states contributes millions. They claim it's environmental responsibility. But I've seen their internal maps. The areas they mark as protected habitats form a pattern, a containment pattern. They're not protecting the forest, they're containing something inside it. The tourist attractions are still operating, still drawing families for those classic photo ops. But watch the maintenance crews next time you visit. Notice how they check the base of every statue before opening. Notice the equipment they carry, not repair tools but measuring devices, seismographs disguised as groundkeeping tools, audio equipment hidden in souvenir stands. 3 weeks ago, a logging operation near Grand Marais was suddenly abandoned. The official statement cited equipment failure, but I talked to one of the workers. He said they found something in the clearance zone. Not tracks this time. A handprint, pressed into solid bedrock, 8 feet wide. The Paul Bunyan statues are still being maintained, still being carefully monitored. But they're not the only ones watching anymore. Park rangers have started finding new patterns in the forest damage. The paths aren't random anymore. They're circular, centered around every major logging operation. Getting closer, like something's tightening the noose. I'm sharing this because the pattern is accelerating. The missing persons reports, the forest damage, the seismic readings, they all show the same thing. It's moving more frequently, growing faster. The containment protocols my grandfather helped establish aren't working anymore. Whatever's out there, whatever the government tried to hide with folklore and tourist traps, it's outgrowing their ability to contain it. Last week, a new Paul Bunyan statue was quietly installed in northern Wisconsin. No ceremony, no announcement, just Forest Service personnel working at night. It's the tallest one yet, 25 feet, and it's facing the forest, not the road. Like a marker or a warning. Because that's the thing about measuring devices. They only work if what you're measuring stays the same size. And according to the latest geological surveys I've managed to access, the impact tremors are getting stronger. The intervals between them, shorter. The government is still hiding everything in plain sight, still pretending it's all just tourist attractions and tall tales. But they can't hide the numbers. Can't hide the pattern. Something is coming. Something that's been growing with every tree we've cut down, every forest we've cleared. And those Paul Bunyan statues, they're not monuments anymore. They're measuring sticks. For something that's already outgrown them. I wasn't going to release these tapes. Not after what I discovered in my grandfather's final journal entry. Not after what I saw last week. But sitting on this information isn't an option anymore. Because it's not just watching now, it's hunting. Last Tuesday, I broke into the Forest Service's restricted archives near Duluth. I had to know what happened during those 3 days my grandfather went missing in 1983. What I found, there was a report, a single page, marked with that same symbol. It described finding him 30 miles from his last known location, standing perfectly still in a clearing, staring up at the sky. When they reached him, he just kept repeating one phrase: "You can't look up. Never look up." I didn't understand what he meant, not until last week. I was following up on those new disappearances near Grand Marais, documenting the patterns. The sun was setting, and I knew I should leave. That's when I heard it, that whistling sound from my grandfather's tapes. But this time, it wasn't coming from old footage. It was directly overhead. The trees started swaying, not from wind. There was no wind. They were making way for something massive. The shadows, they were wrong. All wrong. You know how your shadow gets longer as the sun sets? These were getting shorter. Because whatever was casting them was getting closer, getting lower. I did what my grandfather couldn't do. I didn't look up. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until I couldn't hear the whistling anymore. But I caught something in my peripheral vision as I fled. Just for a second. Just enough to understand why those Paul Bunyan statues keep getting taller. Why the government chose that specific folklore to hide the truth. Because what's walking through our forests isn't a friendly lumberjack. The indigenous people tried to warn us. Their legends never mentioned a blue ox. They spoke of shadows that made the ground glow, of footsteps that left pools of light. What the loggers saw in the 1800s, what my grandfather documented, what's out there right now, it's ancient. It's angry, and it's using our own destruction of the forests to fuel its growth. The truth about my grandfather? He didn't retire in 1983. He didn't just walk away. In his last journal entry, the one I only decoded last night, he wrote, "They think the statues are containing it. They're wrong. The statues are feeding it. Every tourist trap, every gift shop, every crude carving, they're all making it stronger. We gave it a story. We gave it a name. And now it's using our belief, our destruction, our arrogance to grow, to hunt, to feed." 3 days ago, another Paul Bunyan statue was installed near the Boundary Waters, 28 feet tall, the largest yet. But if you look at the satellite images from that area, look at the trees around it, the statue's already too small. The path being cleared through the forest, it's wider than anything in my grandfather's footage. Whatever's making those paths, whatever's leaving those glowing footprints, it's not measuring itself against our markers anymore. I'm releasing these tapes now because the pattern has changed. The disappearances aren't random anymore. They're targeting specific people, people who know too much, people who've seen the evidence. Last night I found a footprint outside my cabin, not in the dirt, in the bedrock, fresh, still glowing. My grandfather's final warning wasn't about looking up. His last written words, the ones that made me finally understand the true horror of what he discovered. It wears the Paul Bunyan story like a mask, but it's growing out of that mask now. And when it finally sheds that mask completely, when it no longer needs our folklore to hide behind, that's when the real harvest begins. I don't have much time left. They're coming for these tapes. Coming for me. But you deserve to know the truth about what's really walking in our forests, about why those statues are still standing, about what happens when you destroy too much of the ancient woods. Just remember what I told you at the beginning. If you're ever in the northern forests and you hear whistling from above the trees, don't look up. Run. Run as fast as you can, because Paul Bunyan isn't watching over our forests anymore. Something much older, much bigger has taken his place, and it's still growing. If you've made it this far, if you've seen what I've shown you, you're already involved. Maybe you've had your own experiences in the northern forests. Maybe you've noticed things about those Paul Bunyan statues that didn't quite add up. Maybe you've heard that whistling above the trees. I know there are others out there with stories. Forest Service workers who've seen the classified files, park rangers who've found those glowing footprints, hikers who've survived encounters. I've seen your posts on obscure forums, your heavily redacted FOIA requests, your desperate attempts to make sense of what you witnessed. But please, listen carefully. Do not try to find what I found. Do not go looking for proof. The coordinates in my grandfather's journals, the locations of the monitoring stations, the patterns in the disappearances, I'm not sharing them for a reason. Because here's what I've learned. It can sense when it's being watched. It can tell when someone's looking for it. And it's drawn to curiosity like a moth to flame. These stories weren't suppressed just to keep the public calm. They were suppressed because every time someone believes, every time someone goes looking for proof, every time someone speaks its true name, it grows stronger. The Paul Bunyan mythology wasn't just a cover-up. It was a containment strategy. A way to hide something ancient and hungry behind something folksy and familiar. Those tourist attractions are still standing because they have to be. They're not just measuring devices anymore, they're warning systems. Pay attention next time you're near one. Watch how the maintenance crews check them at sunrise, always at sunrise. Notice how they measure the shadows, not the statue. Notice how they always work in pairs, so one can watch the tree line while the other takes readings. I've spent the last week uploading all my grandfather's tapes, documents, and journals to secure servers across the globe. By the time you see this, they'll be impossible to completely remove. The truth needs to stay out there. Because it's not just about protecting the forests anymore. It's about surviving what we've awakened inside them. So let me leave you with this final warning, not just from me, but from every ranger, every witness, every survivor who's contacted me since I started this investigation. If you're in the northern woods and you hear whistling from above the trees, do not run. Do not scream. Do not call for help. Stand perfectly still. Close your eyes. Wait for the sound of swaying trees to pass. Wait for the ground to stop shaking. Wait until the glowing footprints fade. Because running makes you a target. Screaming makes you a target. But most of all, looking up makes you its next meal. The Paul Bunyan story taught us to look up to the skies, to admire something giant watching over our forests. But that story was a lie to hide a darker truth. There is something watching over our forests, something that's been watching since before the first settlers arrived, something that's still watching now. And it's not a friendly giant anymore. It's awake, it's angry, and it's hungry. This will be my last upload. If you're watching this, you're one of the few who know the truth. Use it wisely, share it carefully, and whatever you do, don't look up.